The 1980s didn't just make horror, they tested the limits of what a movie could show, say, or even dare to be. It was a decade where screens became battlegrounds and projectors whirred like warning sirens. And in the middle of it all, filmmakers kept pushing forward, armed with latex, audacity, and the conviction that fear should never be polite. This is the story of the films that didn't merely scare people, they provoked them. Together, they marked the 1980s as an age when horror forced society to answer an uncomfortable question. What happens when art refuses to blink? We begin in the jungle, where rumor, reality, and performance blur into one relentless fever. Cannibal Holocaust arrived in 1980 like contraband, too raw to be fiction, too meticulously staged to be documentary, and yet determined to masquerade as both. Presented as recovered reels from a missing film crew, its images were so convincing that authorities in Italy arrested the director and demanded proof that his actors were still alive. He produced them in court like ghosts called back to testify. The charges were dropped, but the stain remained. Real animal deaths were not an illusion. They were the point of no return. Audiences recoiled. Activists mobilized. Politicians found a new target. In country after country, the film was cut, seized, or banished, and yet its power metastasized in the underground. Passed hand to hand on bootleg tapes, the cassette shells warm from the VCR and the risk. If that was horror as jungle trial, Maniac was horror as confession. The same year, in the damp neon of New York's underbelly, a killer stalked the city with a gaze that wouldn't look away. This wasn't a thriller that reassured you by stepping outside the killer's head. It pressed us up against the glass from the inside. Murders unspooled with a gruesome intimacy that felt less like spectacle and more like witness. Special effects didn't hide. They announced themselves with shocking bravado. Feminist groups staged protests. TV stations refused ads. Some theaters lasted days before cutting the lights and closing their doors. And still, in midnight corridors and rep houses with flickering bulbs, whispers brought audiences back. It's too much. It goes too far. You have to see it. Where those two films dared the world to ask, is this real? The Evil Dead asked a different question. What if the camera has no mercy? A cabin, a book bound in human hide, and a small army of possessed bodies. None of that explains why the film felt so dangerous. The danger was in its velocity. The camera flew like a demon through the woods. The gore was a tide that wouldn't stop rising. Religious groups called it satanic. Police in the UK raided shops to pull tapes. Regional US theaters declined bookings or backed out when the complaints stacked higher than the popcorn boxes. But banning a storm doesn't stop the rain. Fans copied the movie until the image ghosted and bled, the way legends do. Word of mouth turned into a chorus, a shoestring miracle, a midnight dare, proof that passion plus audacity equals terror you can't scrub from your mind. If chaotic delirium defined that cabin, the Beyond carved a door and invited oblivion in. Premise sounds simple. A woman inherits a hotel built over a gateway to hell. But what unfurls is not a plot so much as a waking nightmare. Eyes pierced by spikes, faces melting into chemical rain, silence vibrating like a held breath that never lets go. In the US, censors hacked at it and retitled it for release. In the UK and elsewhere in Europe, uncut screenings triggered complaints, and distributors quietly stepped back before regulators stepped in. For years, the true version lived in the shadows, shared like a secret that burned the tongue. Later, critics would call it poetry. At the time, it felt like a trespass you could be arrested for seeing. By 1982, stylish violence had a poet laureate, and he turned the blade on himself. Tenebrae was a meta-slasher that staged murders like ballets of crimson against stark, modernist white. Camera glided over walls, through windows, across rooftops. Elegant, omniscient, complicit. Its most infamous sequence exploded into a double dismemberment that left the audience shocked, and the wallpaper read. Protesters cried misogyny, censors cried obscenity. In the UK, the title became a legal albatross, dragged across lists and into courtrooms. Theaters that dared to book it sometimes found picket lines waiting outside and silence blinking on their switchboards inside. Years later, its craft would be praised for what it truly was: a filmmaker staging a debate about media violence inside a fever dream. In 1982, that debate was conducted with padlocks and seizures. Then there was a film that didn't hide its appetite behind metaphor. Pieces promised exactly what it was and delivered it with a chainsaw's grin. A campus slasher drenched in grindhouse bravado, it refused to flinch, refused to apologize. refused to pretend it was anything other than what it was. Exploitation pitched so loud you could feel it in your teeth. People walked out. Newspapers refused ads. Managers stared at the lobby clock and wondered how many more showings they could risk before the complaints pulled them under. In the UK, authorities didn't debate the poster, they took the tapes. And yet, like so many forbidden films, it learned the oldest magic trick in horror. The fewer the screens, the bigger the legend. If the chainsaw caused outrage, a red suit and fur trim caused fury. The world. Night took the most sacrosanct image in American holiday iconography and put an axe in its hand. The movie itself is a straightforward tragedy-turned-slasher, but the marketing was gasoline. Commercials ran between family programs, and suddenly Saint Nick wasn't a guardian of gifts. He was the face of dread. Parents protested in droves. Editorials fumed. Theaters caved. A major distributor withdrew the film while it was making money. A rare move that said more about cultural fear than ticket sales. Time would soften this scandal into cult nostalgia and a parade of sequels, but that first December told a sharper truth. Symbols are powerful, and if you swing at them, they swing back. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the boundary between special effects and urban legend dissolved into a single terrible rumor. Guinea pig. Flowers of flesh and blood circulated on the margins, a whispered challenge spoken into payphones and traded in brown envelopes. The premise: a man in samurai garb abducts a woman and dismembers her with methodical precision. The execution, effects so convincing that some viewers believed they were watching the unthinkable. Authorities were contacted, investigations were launched. Only demonstrations of the props and techniques calmed the storm. Screenings that tried to legitimize it as art or transgression often met with swift pressure to stop. This wasn't a movie that passed through theaters. It seeped through back rooms, testing how far an image can go before the law itself looks away. Back in the jungle of exploitation cinema, Make Them Die Slowly, also known internationally as Cannibal Ferox, wore its notoriety like a marketing campaign and still managed to earn the bans it boasted. The violence pushed past the threshold of endurance, and the film's treatment of animals sparked immediate, virulent condemnation. Grindhouses that built their reputations on weathering storms found this one especially corrosive. Even they, seasoned as they were, felt the drag of law and outrage. In some cities, authorities didn't need a ruling. A warning was enough to make the projector go dark. The film's director defended it with claims of morality. Most audiences answered with the simplest moral verdict of all: no. And then came a different kind of terror entirely, the quiet dread of a human predator filmed without sensational fireworks. Henry, portrait of a serial killer, lingers because it refuses the release valve. There's no orchestral sting to tell you when to gasp, no cosmic justice to assure you the world is balanced. Violence is filmed like rain on concrete, present, indifferent, chilling in its normality. Ratings boards didn't know what to do with something that was so calm, so unblinking, so morally unaccommodating. The refusal to soften or stylize made the film radioactive to mainstream exhibitors. In the few theaters that dared, walkouts were common, complaints inevitable. And then, as so often happens, the film found its audience where fear is most honest, in small rooms on small screens, late at night, when the ordinary feels like a threat. Some films ignite outrage with politics, others with gore. Nekromantik did it with Taboo, a low-budget German shock to the system. It treated the unsayable not as a punchline, but as intimacy. Corpses, desire, domesticity. The film arranged them like a still life that made you nauseous to look at, and even sicker to look away from. Classification boards declined to play gatekeeper, and simply shut the gate. Midnight screenings that did proceed were sometimes interrupted, not by critics but by police. The movie didn't just stretch the envelope, it left it in shreds. And yet the very extremity that got it, chased out of public view, made it a whispered rite of passage in underground circles. People didn't ask, "Is it good?" They asked, "Could you get through it?" Where Nekromantik dragged a Taboo into the living room, Hellraiser carved open the boundary between agony and ceremony. Here was a film not content with slashers or jump scares, but one that built a theology. The box was a prayer. The answer was a revelation of hooks and paradox. Some communities saw only perversion and protested accordingly. Certain theater chains in conservative regions opted out, fearing the combination of eroticism and explicit violence would scorch their marquees. Others booked it and discovered that fascination can outpace revulsion. Audiences had never seen anything like it. Leather, law, geometry, and sin, bound into a cosmology you could almost believe in. Where censors tried to corral it, curiosity simply climbed the walls. And then, like a dare sent through the mail, Faces of Death re-emerged in 1988 to test whether audiences could or should consume mortality as a curated spectacle. The film had already built a reputation a decade earlier by stitching together staged scenes with fragments of reality, asking viewers to accept the whole as something terrible and true. The late 80s climate was less forgiving. Protests erupted, rumors flared, critics drew a line in the sand and wrote the title across it. In markets where screenings persisted, some were cut short by visits from officials who didn't need to see the film to know they didn't want it shown. Elsewhere, the ban lists had already done their work, and yet, paradoxically, every canceled run minted another collector's item. The forbidden always finds an audience. Horror learned that lesson long ago. What unites these films isn't just their imagery, but the reaction they provoked. Laws were invoked. In the end, these movies didn't vanish because someone scowled. They transformed into rumors, into trophies, into cult objects guarded like cursed relics. Horror has never promised comfort, not to audiences, not to exhibitors, not to anyone who tries to tell it where the line is. It walks the line, it chalks the line, it erases the line and draws it again, this time closer to the bone. That is why these films were pulled, and that is why they survived. Which of these forbidden reels would you brave? Which would you turn off, swear off, and still find in your thoughts at 3 a.m.? The 1980s asked those questions loudly. We're still whispering the answers. Subscribe for more journeys into cinema's sealed vaults.